I want to speak a bit about the importance of oral history, of Albanian oral history, and of my modest experience. After Alessandro Portelli, I'm rather reluctant to speak on the subject of oral history, as I know too little about the practicalities of it. However, I'd like to provide you just with a few thoughts on my experience in a number of closely related fields. Perhaps not profound experience, but just a few ideas. Firstly, the importance of oral tradition among the Albanians. Let me say something about the importance of orality in the Albanian-speaking world. In my view, oral tradition and oral history are much more important among the Albanians than they are elsewhere in Europe. There are several good reasons for this. Firstly, Albanian history has been largely written by foreigners, not by Albanians, although the latter should normally know more about what has happened in their past. This has been a result of acute underdevelopment in Albania and Kosovo, and in particular, of long-standing illiteracy. At the time of the communist takeover in Albania and Kosovo in 1944, illiteracy cast its shadow over about 80% of the male population and virtually all the women, who are the prime bearers of oral culture. The women were simply illiterate beasts of burden. In Kosovo, the level of female education is still among the lowest in Europe, although things are changing rapidly, as we know. Secondly, the destruction of cultural assets over the centuries has been enormous among the Albanians. When I speak of cultural assets, I mean libraries, monasteries, books, manuscripts. There is probably not a single Albanian town or village that has not been burnt to the ground in war or fighting, or been destroyed in some other way at one time or another. The past of the Albanians is tragic, and it is a tragedy that is wrapped in dense fog. As a result, much of what is now written about the country and its history is pure speculation. What do we actually know about important topics such as the early history of the Albanians, about their origins and development? What do we even know about the realities of the Second World War in Albania? Or about the communist dictatorships that took over in Albania and Kosovo thereafter? Very little. The communist regime that held sway took over in Albania for almost half a century, had its very own distorted narrative of Albanian history, and certainly a distorted view of its own role in that history. And it ensured that this narrative was taught in all schools for 2 or 3 centuries, including in this building itself. It did much to eradicate backwardness and illiteracy in Albania. But at the same time, they stamped out much tradition, in particular with the radical destruction of the religious communities in the late 1960s, and with the suppression of traditional beliefs, superstitions, and old customs. Even things as simple as the transmission of oral information on cooking, Albanian cuisine, was interrupted by a chronic lack of foodstuffs in the 1980s. What was the point of mothers teaching their daughters how to cook if there were no ingredients on the market? If there were only leeks and potatoes on the market, what do you have to teach your daughters? And so this information disappeared to a large extent. Albanian oral history has suffered elsewhere too, in particular in regions where the native Albanian narrative has been overlaid by another narrative of history. I'm speaking here of the Kosovo Albanians and of the Chams, whose history was written and was widely deformed by neighboring peoples for their own purposes. Up to a few years ago, anyone interested in the history of Kosovo or Chamaria had to refer to books written by Serbian and Greek scholars, and it must be said, in many cases, not all, by Serbian and Greek propagandists. So what I'm saying is that much has been destroyed, much has been lost, but there is still much to be discovered, and it can be discovered in part through oral history. I just want to conclude with a few words on my own experience with oral tradition, which is not much, but I will tell you what I've been involved in. In view of the destruction of Albanian culture and of the sources of Albanian history, it became very important for me to gather and publish what could still be found in folk tradition. The results of my endeavors were compiled in my book, Dictionary of Albanian Religion, Mythology, and Folk Culture, published in New York in 1991. The Albanian translation was published as Lexiku I Kulturës Populare Shqiptare in Tirana in 2005. And there's a German version called Handbuch der Albanischen Volkskunde, which was reprinted last year. In fact, I have it here. Yes. This is the German version here of the book, just for your information. It became evident to me that much traditional information on Albanian folk culture, for instance on customs, on superstitions, on mythology, was lost in Albania after half a century of communist dictatorship. But much of it was preserved in the more traditional cultures of the Albanians in Kosovo and in Macedonia. Perhaps my most immediate contact with recording oral tradition has been in my interest in the Albanian language and Albanian dialects. You may have heard of my website, www.albanianlanguage.net, on which I have presented about 200 dialect recordings. This website has been offline for a while and is presently being relaunched in a more modern format so that the recordings can be heard not only on computers but also on tablets and cell phones. Each dialect recording contains basic information on the dialect, on the speaker, and on the subject matter. The project began during the Kosovo War, when we conducted recordings with refugees at a refugee camp here in Tirana, at the Te Pishinat, right, where there were lots of Kosovo refugees who were quite willing to talk. I did most of the recordings, made from 1999 to the present, myself, with the help of my Albanian driver, Artur Metani, who is extremely skilled in overcoming any hesitation on the part of speakers. Typically, we stopped shepherds at the roadside and recorded their speech. My interest was primarily linguistic, but I think there's a wide range of material in the recordings, enough to keep experts on oral tradition happy. In some cases, we provoked the speaker with a question, but in many cases it was quite sufficient just to stand there at the roadside and let them say whatever was on their mind. People like to talk. Anyway, there are now 200 recordings in the collection. They're short, they're usually from 2 to 15 minutes long, and they include Albanian from all the countries where Albanian is traditionally spoken, right? Albania, Kosovo, Montenegro, Macedonia, Greece, and Italy. Just for your information, I was informed by my web designer this morning that the portion on Macedonia is also online. So Albania, Kosovo, and Macedonia are online, and the other portions will come very soon. So there will be a total of 200 recordings. But as I say, excuse me, my interest was purely on the Albanian dialects, not what people said, but how they said it. Now, I'm sure Alessandro will think that's very strange, because he's interested in rather what people say and not how they say it, but such was my interest. Secondly, my more recent interest in oral tradition has been in Albanian oral literature, folk tales, legends, oral epic verse. I haven't done any folklore recording, folk tale recording directly myself, but I've translated and published much earlier and contemporary material. Among my recent publications in the field are a book called Albanian Folk Tales and Legends, which I have here, once again with a wonderful picture on the cover. And a second book, which I have here too, which is called the Hasluk Collection of Albanian Folk Tales, published last year. This is the collection of Margaret Hasluk, the Scottish anthropologist who lived in Albania in the 1920s and 30s and collected folk tales in central Albania primarily, but they were never published. Margaret Hasluk was a very good scholar, but she was not good at publishing things. So the material remained in manuscript form, and I managed to find it in Oxford and typed it all, I must say, to my own. I spent a whole winter, last winter, every morning I got up an hour early and typed a fairy tale. Anyway, there are about 80 or 85 Albanian folk tales here. It is actually the largest collection in English. At the moment, I'm currently preparing an anthology of Albanian folk tales in German. It's based on the work of noted scholars such as Johann Georg von Hahn, Gustav Meyer, Jan Orvan Jarnik, August Leskin, Holger Pedersen, and Maximilian Lamberts. 25 years have passed since the dictatorship here, and perhaps some people will want to record their place in that murky chapter of history. Pardon. Secondly, the oral history of Albanians from regions outside of Albania, whose narrative, as I suggested above, has been superimposed by others. I'm speaking here of the tragic history of the Albanian Chams from 1945 on, and of course of the Kosovo Albanians during the 1998-1999 war, not to mention the Albanians of Macedonia and elsewhere, whose place in history has been somewhat suppressed or at least ignored. Not to be forgotten is the collective memory of the last generation of speakers of Arvanitic Albanian in central Greece. These people are all above the age of 80, and their collective memory will very soon be gone. And as far as I know, no one is doing anything to preserve it. So these are just a few modest suggestions. I'm sure there are many other fields where oral tradition can preserve much of what has been lost and is being lost very rapidly in Albanian culture. But I think I should leave this to the real experts here among us. So, thank you very much. I just turned it off. Yeah.
We do have some time for questions.
I came from art field and culture in general, but I have some questions about terminology.
but terminology.
Terminology.
Okay?
Generally, in Albania, we can define the dictatorships period as communist, but I don't think that we have documents to confirm this term, because Albania was never communist. It was declared socialist, popular socialist republic, or democratic republic at the beginning. So I think it's a little bit tricky, this term, because it opens different deviations or prejudgments on a certain period. I don't think that we have a communist country in general in the world, as I know. I don't remember. So to define communist Albania or communist country, I think it's a little bit tricky in terms of in scientific terms. I wanted just to know what you think about it. Thank you.
Let me have the microphone. Kan mos se të kam memori të shkurtër, nuk e mbaj mend 2-3 pyetje. Yes, I think you're quite. That's an interesting question. The word communist. Communist in the ideal form, of course, there has never been a communist society on earth. You know, communism was always the ideal of a just modern society, and everywhere the communists took power, except possibly in San Marino, they ended in a terrible dictatorship, right? Whether we call them social, you can't call them socialist either, because they didn't even bring about the ideals of socialism. What the so-called Albanian communists created was very much a class society, whereas the ideals of communism were, of course, to create a classless society. And what did you have in Albania? You had a 3-class society, right? You had the broad masses of the people, you had the red aristocracy, and then you had the lower class of kulaks and people in internment camps, right? Very clear distinction of 3 classes of society, such that one class did not speak to the other class, right? If we call the dictatorship in Albania simply the dictatorship, it's not really clear, because the Zogist period was also a dictatorship. In fact, all of Albanian history was in fact a dictatorship. It's only been since 1990 that there's been more or less democracy, right? When was Albania not a dictatorship? It was always run by people who did what they want. Certainly the Zogist period is a very good example, right? So, yes, I agree that perhaps the word communist is not right, but it's generally used, of course, to describe the period of the, what would you call it then if you didn't call it a communist dictatorship?
I'm sorry, I'm speaking without mic. I think that is very easy for certain propaganda, let's say, not the scientific sectors or people who studied really in history or sociology, etc., etc. But it's a certain propaganda that wants to parallelize or to make equal fascism, Nazism, and communism, and I think it is not so fair, because we have to clarify a lot in these terms. Maybe if we call that period with the name of dictator, for example, and verism, we often is not a scientific term yet, but I think it's more fair that communist dictatorship.
Excuse me, how the members of the party, how were they called? Were they called communists? Is it a Marxist?
I do think that.
Please, let's not have it say. I think it would be really interesting, because one of the things we are discovering or discussing in Kosovo is this, post-communist memory, in which certain labels of the faces of the past have been reclassified, rejected, and interpreted. And so this is a debate that actually maybe deserves an entire session. It's post-communist memory.
Yeah.
To finish the session, so this morning, this microphone is Okay. So maybe if we can wrap up this with questions that we can have quickly. I've got a couple of questions on this.
It's okay, I don't have the mic, I guess. It's okay. Mr. Elsie, thank you very much for being here today. And Ms. Dimitra, thank you very much for organizing all of this, of course, in partnership with our faculty. Mr. Elsie, as a person that has dedicated too much time of your life for Albanians and Albanian studies, what should be your advice today to our scholars, to our students of history and literature, and to our academics, even in Kosovo or Albania? How should they study and write their history?
Oh, that's a very big question. I'm not sure if I have an answer to that. There are nowadays very good scholars, very good historians. We have one right here who are doing excellent work. But there is still much more to be done. There are too few people involved in studies. Obviously, it's a financial question. You don't make $1 million if you're working as a historian. You make probably more money if you drive a taxi, right? So it is very hard for people to be dedicated to their history and to their culture. But I think everyone can make a contribution. But I really don't have a recommendation. Sorry, that's too high for me. Next, anything else? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I'm curious on a question that you might face during your research. Since you were all the time searching after Albanian heritage, have you seen that we as a nation, we are not aware about our own heritage? It's not always fault on others that destroyed our history and our heritage. Also we are, in a way, fault that we didn't preserve as much, we didn't treat it as it needs to be. So what do you think? Why we are like that? Why? Is it because maybe all the time we were based on surviving and we need to live? So fighting to preserve our own life instead of preserving history or heritage or things like that? Or there is another problem? So why we as a nation are such not aware on our inheritance?
I'm not really sure if I can answer that question either. I said earlier that there's probably not one town in the Albanian world which hasn't been destroyed by fire, burnt to the ground at some time or another. And I was not talking about foreigners burning them down. The Albanians are very good at burning down their own stuff, right? At destroying. Destruction is an element, I don't know, of the Albanians over history. There's been terrible destruction. And I think that has limited the possibilities to delve into history. I think the Albanians are potentially interested in their history, and especially when they have to defend themselves, as the Kosovo Albanians have had to do. They're very interested in their history, but there is so much that has been destroyed and lost that it is very hard. And there is also the traditional element of illiteracy. Too few people who knew how to write things down over the course of history, who knew how to preserve things. So anything that was preserved through oral history, and that is why it is very important. I'm very surprised, for instance, a very small example. I've written a book about the tribes of northern Albania, Fiset e Baraqit e Shqipërisë, in which I tried to gather all the information on the history of each tribe in northern Albania. It's a very strange mixture of information, but I got a lot of information from Baron Nopcha, the Hungarian specialist who traveled in the north in 1907. And he said that each tribe, which was a fis, right, not the Bairace, which was a fis, knew exactly who their ancestors were going back 12, 15 generations. They could name them, they knew who the son of so-and-so was, the grandson, And going back, imagine, 15 generations, the people knew that. And even today, I've traveled in the north, and you can talk to people who still know that. Now, there is no record of the ancestral history, no written record, no books, no little manuscript that they hide in a church in any of these regions. It's all here, and it is preserved. So there is a lot that can be garnered, found in oral history, and that's why it is important.
The last one.
Kosovo, as you're probably aware, there has been a movement recently since the end of the war, not just building a new state in Kosovo, but to build a new nation of Kosovo. I was wondering, based on your studies and collections, what do you think are the chances that this new identity that is currently being pushed by the international community, especially in Kosovo, has to succeed in building a new nation, or the new nation of Kosovo, as separate from that of Albania?
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting question, although I don't know if I can give you a good answer. I remember about 10 years ago, maybe more, I was in Pristina at the university, went out the door of the university, and all of a sudden there were television cameras there, right? And someone asked me the question, is there a Kosovo identity? Right? And I said very naively, yeah, of course there's a Kosovo identity. Kosovars are different. They're Kosovo Albanians, the others are Albanian Albanians. And this got into the press, of course, because the cameras were rolling, and it caused a great scandal in Kosovo, especially among Kosovar intellectuals. They said there is no separate Kosovar identity. We are Albanians, we are Albanians, we are Albanians. And there was a great, great commotion and over something which I had just very innocently said, as I do so often. It caused a bit of a scandal. I don't think that the same thing would happen now. I was just asking some people last night, I won't mention any names, but some people who are here from Kosovo, here in Tirana. I asked them, is this your country? Do you feel at home here? And they were all sort of, yeah, but not entirely. It's not really our country, right? So there are obviously different identities. And I think there is I still think there's a strong Kosovar identity, that a Kosovo Albania and an Albanian Albanian are not the same animals, they're different animals, right? Because of history. They may want to join, they want to be one, and why not? But at the moment, I think there are two different cultures. Now, whether you can create a nation is a bit more difficult. That depends on a lot of political factors, on the survival of Kosovo as a nation, on its international recognition. And things are coming along, but not as they possibly should have or could have. It is still a nation or a country, it is still in very difficult circumstances at the moment, as you know, because of the political situation, because of hostility from Serbia, primarily, but for other factors, the lack of political and economic development and all these things. But that goes far beyond me. I think at the moment it is possible to create a Kosovo nation, although you do have the additional problem of having different ethnic groups in the country who may not all have the same identity. But time will tell. There's certainly an Albanian identity among the Kosovo Albanians. And if it doesn't work out, there's always Albania. But let us hope that it does. I see no reason why Kosovo shouldn't join the rest of the world as a normal state like everyone else. But that is not really a definitive answer to your question. I'm sorry. That's just a few remarks.
I think we can close it. I just want to add something to this, because anytime I read a nation building plan, I Friday. Because when you buy a nation, real name, there is a project building something, but you cannot build a nation. A nation, I mean, unless you force the nation to be something. Nation is constructed through century, through history, through culture, through language, through all of it. So don't ever write, I always tell my students, don't write an educational building, state building. State building you can plan. You can build a port, you can build a parliament, you don't build a nation. Certainly you don't build it as the UN or a foreign government that does a nation what to be. So it's a very complicated but also very simple notion, and I'd like to.
Yeah, and I don't really think that you need a nation. I come from a country that doesn't really have a nationality or a nation, from Canada. What is a Canadian? It's someone with a Canadian passport, but I don't have a nationality, and I'm quite fine. Live quite well without a nationality. I've talked to people in Austria, for instance, and asked them, are you Austrians or are you Germans? And they very often say, to my surprise, oh, we're Germans like everyone else. There's just a border. Okay, so there's totally different ways of building identities, and whether you build a nation doesn't really matter. It is what it is, and it will be what it is.
Thank you very much.
Okay.